Hey everyone, and welcome back. You ready to get our hands dirty with some serious web scraping?
Always ready to dive into some code.
Well, today we're tackling a question that comes up all the time. Python or JavaScript?
Yeah.
Which one should you choose for your next scraping project?
The age-old debate.
And luckily, we've got a great guide from Rebrowser to help us sort it all out.
Oh yeah, Rebrowser, they really know their stuff when it comes to all things web scraping and browser automation. Definitely a good source for this deep dive.
Sure.
Okay.
So let's jump right in. Choosing the right language can make a huge difference in how well your project goes.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's not just about what you can scrape, but more like how efficiently you can get it done.
So, big picture first.
Yeah.
What are the core differences between these languages when you're thinking about using them for web scraping?
Well, Python,
Yeah.
it's kind of famous for being user-friendly. The syntax is really readable, even if you're, brand new to coding.
Yeah, that's what I've always heard. Python is a good one to start with. Yeah. And then you've got all these data analysis libraries in Python. Pandas, NumPy, all the heavy hitters.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. Powerful stuff.
Yeah. So if you're thinking of doing more with the data than just like collecting it, you know.
Right, like analyzing it to figure something out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like if you're scraping financial data, you could analyze it to spot trends or maybe you're dealing with huge data sets and you want to find hidden patterns. That's where Python really shines.
Python, the data detective. So where does that leave JavaScript?
JavaScript. Well, JavaScript is all about dynamic content. You know those websites that load more content as you scroll down?
Oh, yeah, all of them.
Right? Or those sites with interactive elements that like change based on what you do. That's JavaScript's home turf. It's built for the modern web. So
Yeah.
for scraping those trickier, more interactive websites.
JavaScript's the go-to.
Yeah, it's essential, I'd say.
Okay, so we've got two different languages, two different sets of strengths. Now, the guy did mention that Python has a gentle learning curve.
It does, yeah.
Good news for beginners, right? What do you think? Are there any tools out there that are like too much for someone who's just starting out?
That's a good question. I mean, Python's often the one that people recommend as a first language just because it's so like approachable. And that definitely applies to scraping too.
Right. You don't need to be a coding master to get started.
Exactly. I mean, sure, some of the tools are definitely more complex than others, but for basic scraping, Python's a great place to start.
So let's talk about some of those tools. When we're talking about Python and web scraping, what are some of the must-haves? The
Yeah.
things you absolutely got to know?
Okay, well, Python's got this great lineup. You've got beautiful soup for parsing website code. So it's like, your trusty sidekick for pulling out specific data from all that HTML or XML.
Makes sense.
Very straightforward. And then there's Scrapey, which is more like your whole scraping Swiss Army knife.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a framework. It helps you manage those like larger projects, the ones that get a little more complex.
So Scrapey keeps you organized, kind of like a project manager for your scraping tasks.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so Beautiful Soup and Scrapey, those are good starting points. But what about when things get tricky? What if you need to get around a website that's trying to block scrapers? Or maybe you have to interact with the site in a more, like, human way.
Right. Well, for that, there's tools like Selenium and Playwright.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. Those let you automate what you do in the browser. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Like imagine a little robot that's browsing the web for you. It can do all sorts of things, like clicking buttons, filling out forms, scrolling through pages.
So it's like mimicking how a real person would use the website.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So you can bypass a lot of those anti-scraping measures, and you can interact with websites in a much more, dynamic way.
Super clever. So Selenium and Playwright for the tricky stuff. Now, I noticed the guide even includes this simple Python code example to show you how it all works. What's that about?
Yeah, it's a great example of how simple Python can be for like basic scraping tasks. You could use it to grab, say, product titles and prices from an online store with just a handful of lines of code.
Nice. So you're telling me I could build my own price comparison tool?
It's a good starting point. Basically, it just fetches the web page, parses the HTML, and boom, you've got your data.
Easy peasy. So Python, it's user-friendly, it's got tons of tools, it's great for analyzing data. But let's talk about JavaScript. The guide did mention that it can be a bit tougher to learn, especially when it comes to something called asynchronous programming. Should we be worried about that?
Well, asynchronous programming can be a bit, I guess, a bit intimidating at first. But really, it's just a way to handle tasks that might take a while. Like waiting for a web page to load. You don't want your whole program to just freeze up while it's waiting, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Keep things moving.
Exactly. So asynchronous programming lets you handle those things in the background without blocking everything else. So for example, if you're scraping a website where new products are loading as you scroll down.
Like a infinite scrolling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Asynchronous programming lets you grab those new items as they load without waiting for the entire page to reload every single time. Much, much more efficient.
Okay, so it's a bit of a learning curve, but if you're dealing with dynamic websites, asynchronous programming in JavaScript sounds like it's worth the effort. But once we've tamed this asynchronous beast, what kind of scraping superpowers does JavaScript give us?
Well, it all comes back to that idea of JavaScript being like built for the modern web, all that dynamic content. That's where JavaScript really shines for scraping. It lets you get into those complex interactive websites and pull out the data you need.
All right, so what about the tools? Give me the rundown of JavaScript's scraping toolkit. What are we working with here?
All right, so for browser automation, you've got Puppeteer and Playwright. They're kind of like Selenium, but most people consider them more modern and a lot more versatile. You get this like fine-grained control over the browser, so you can handle even the most, the trickiest websites out there.
Yeah.
And then for parsing HTML and actually getting to the data you want, Cheerio is your go-to tool in JavaScript.
Cheerio, okay.
Yeah, it's super fast and efficient. Kind of like Beautiful Soup's JavaScript cousin, if you will.
Got it. A powerful combo for those dynamic sites. And speaking of dynamic, the guide even shows an example of how JavaScript can handle scraping a page that uses infinite scrolling, something that can be a real pain in Python without the right tools. I feel like infinite scrolling is everywhere these days.
Oh yeah, you're right. Tons of websites use it now.
Oh.
And this example really shows how JavaScript can like natively handle this type of content. It's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah.
It stimulates the user scrolling down the page.
Yeah.
So they can grab all that data as it loads dynamically.
That's really clever. So we've got Python, the data whiz, and JavaScript, the dynamic web expert. But what happens when your project needs both?
Well, that's where the hybrid approach comes in.
Hybrid, okay.
Yeah, and it's getting more and more popular. Developers are starting to realize, hey, I can use both Python and JavaScript, and I can really, get the best of both worlds for these complex scraping projects.
So it's like having an all-star team, right?
Exactly. The best of both worlds.
So walk me through that. How would that actually work in practice? How do you use both languages together?
So imagine this, right? You use JavaScript to, flex those dynamic web skills.
Mm-hmm.
Go in, grab all that tricky content from a website, and then you seamlessly hand that data over to Python to do what it does best. Process it, analyze it, make sense of it all. It's like a match made in heaven.
Each language plays to its strengths. I like it. Now, the guide does mention something called microservices architecture related to this. What is that exactly? That sounds kind of technical.
It is a little more on the advanced side, but think of it like building with Legos. Each Lego brick does one very specific thing really well.
Okay, I'm listening.
So with microservices, you're basically breaking down a big task into like smaller, more manageable chunks. And each of those chunks is handled by a separate service. So you might have one service that scrapes the data with JavaScript, then another service processes that data with Python, and so on.
So it's all about breaking things down and making them modular.
Yeah. It's how the pros build, really scalable, really robust systems.
Got it. Like a well-oiled machine, each
Yeah.
part doing its job. Okay, so that makes sense. Even if we're not building, something super massive, it's good to know those options are out there. Now, regardless of which language you choose, are there any universal tips for just making scraping projects, more efficient? Things that everyone should know?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Whether you're Team Python, Team JavaScript, or, rucking the hybrid approach, there are definitely some performance optimization techniques that can make a huge difference. One of the most important things is to be mindful of how often you're sending requests to a website.
So don't overload them.
Right. You don't want to bombard their servers with too many requests all at once, or they might just block you. It's kind of like, being a good house guest.
Don't overstay your welcome.
Exactly.
I like that analogy.
Well, yeah, pacing yourself is key.
So pacing is key. What else? Any other tips for being polite web guests?
Another really great technique is to use something called connection pooling. So it's basically a way to reuse connections to a server, which can save you a ton of time and resources, especially if you're making lots of requests to the same website.
So less overhead.
Yeah, exactly. It's like carpooling for your web requests.
Yeah.
Efficient and de-environmentally friendly.
Nice. Love the carpool analogy. What about if you need to access the same information like over and over again? Are there any tips for that?
Well, then caching is your best friend. So if you're going to be requesting the same data repeatedly, caching basically lets you store a copy of it locally, right, on your computer. So instead of fetching it from the website every single time, you can just grab it from your local cache.
So it's like having a little library of website data right there on your computer.
Exactly. Always ready to go. Caching can make your scraping lightning fast.
Very cool. So we've got throttling to avoid overloading servers, pooling to reuse connections, and caching to keep things speedy. What if you're working on a truly massive scraping project? What do you do then?
Well, when you're dealing with those really large-scale scraping projects, you might want to consider distributed scraping.
Okay, distributed scraping. What's that all about?
So basically, it's like having a whole team of scrapers all working in parallel. Each one tackles a different piece of the puzzle. You can even spread the workload across multiple computers to really, speed things up.
So from carpooling to teamwork, web scraping's getting pretty social. All right, so after all of that, how do you actually decide which language is right for your project? How do you choose?
It really all boils down to a few key factors, and the guy does a great job of laying them out. First, think about the type of website you're targeting. Is it mostly static content? Or is it a really dynamic site? Lots of interactive elements, content changing all the time.
Okay, static versus dynamic. Seems like a big one. What else should we be thinking about?
Well, you also want to think about your existing expertise. Like if you're already a Python pro, it probably makes sense to, stick with what you know. Same goes for JavaScript. Don't underestimate the value of working with a language that you're already comfortable with.
Yeah, choose your weapon wisely, right?
Exactly.
If you're good with a sword, don't try to use a bow and arrow. Stick to what you know.
Exactly.
All right, so project type and our comfort level with the languages. Makes sense.
Yeah. And if you know you're going to be doing a lot of data analysis with the information you scrape, remember Python has all those super powerful libraries that we talked about earlier. It's a data crunching machine.
Right, right. So project type, our expertise, and what we're going to do with the data. Anything else?
One last thing to consider is your scaling needs. If you think your project's going to grow a lot down the line, you might want to consider that hybrid approach,
Yeah.
Using both Python and JavaScript.
Right, so you have that flexibility to scale up if you need to.
Exactly.
So there's a lot to consider. But one thing's for sure, the future of web scraping is looking pretty exciting. The guide mentions some really interesting trends that are emerging. What are you most excited about personally?
One of the things that I find really fascinating is this rise of headless browsers.
Headless browser?
Yeah, they're like these invisible web surfers. They're browsing the web, but without a visual interface.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, so you can scrape much faster, and it's more efficient because you're not wasting resources like loading up a whole graphical browser window.
So it's like a secret agent browsing the web incognito, gathering information without leaving a trace.
Uh-huh. I love that analogy. And another trend that's really worth keeping an eye on is this shift towards API-first solutions. So more and more websites are offering APIs, which are basically like direct lines to their data. So instead of scraping, you can often just get the data you need straight from the source.
Okay, so going straight to the source. No need for scraping.
Exactly. It's usually way more reliable, way more efficient, because you're working with structured data that's designed for easy access.
So it's like getting the information straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Exactly.
Pretty convenient. What else? Any other trends we should have on our radar?
Oh, there's definitely more. AI-powered extraction is getting really interesting. It's basically using machine learning to pull out very specific data points from web pages, even if the structure of those pages is kind of messy or inconsistent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's like having this super smart assistant that can just sift through all the clutter and find exactly what you need.
So less brute force scraping and more targeted smart extraction.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that, all of this should be done responsibly. The guide really emphasizes ethical scraping, respecting those terms of service, not overloading servers.
Right, right. Be a good web citizen.
Exactly. You don't want to be a data monster.
No data monsters allowed. So after all this talk about Python and JavaScript and web scraping, what's the big takeaway? Is there a clear winner? Which one's better?
At the end of the day, there's no single, best language. The right tool really depends on what you're working on, your project, your goals.
Find the right tool for the job. Don't just follow the hype.
Exactly. And the best developers are the ones who are always, adaptable, always learning. The web's always changing. So being open to new tools and technologies is so important. And frankly, knowing both Python and JavaScript can give you a real edge in the world of web scraping.
100% agree. So after this deep dive, I gotta ask, what kind of project would you tackle if you had like the power of both Python and JavaScript at your fingertips? Like, what's your dream scraping project?
It's a really good question. With both, huh? Well, I think it'd be amazing to build a system that could, like, analyze trends and discussions online,
Ah,
around certain topics. Like, imagine being able to track how public sentiment is evolving on social media or news sites or even forums, all in real time.
oh, that would be so cool. Like you could track the spread of misinformation, see how social movements are forming, or even like how people are reacting to new products or policies. So many possibilities. Okay.
Exactly. And with JavaScript handling all that dynamic content and Python crunching the numbers, you can get really specific with the analysis. It wouldn't just be about what people are saying, but how they're saying it.
Mm,
All those nuances of language and sentiment be like having your finger on the pulse of the whole online world.
I love that idea. It's kind of mind-blowing. Makes me wonder what kind of incredible projects our listener could dream up.
That's a good point. So what about you listening right now? What kind of project would you create if you had the power of both Python 80 JavaScript at your disposal? Something that could change the world, something groundbreaking, or even just something fun.
What are you going to build? We want to hear all about it. Head over to our website or share your thoughts on social media with the hashtag Deep Dive Scrape.
And hey, maybe we'll even feature some of your ideas on a future episode.
That wraps up our deep dive into Python versus JavaScript for web scraping. Big thanks to Rebrowser for that awesome guide. And remember, there's no one right answer here. It's all about knowing the strengths of each language and choosing the best tool for the job.
Couldn't agree more. And always keep learning. The web's always changing, so stay curious, explore those new technologies, and see what you can build.
Happy scraping, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.